evening and welcome. My name is Zachary Bennett. I'm an assistant professor in the political science department here at Michigan State University. On behalf of my colleagues at the Refract Forum on Science, Reason, and Modern Democracy, it's my sincere honor and pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, Dr. Chris as political philosophy and Rousseau as author, consecrating one's life to the truth. Dr. Kelly is also the co-editor and co-translator of the collected writings of Rousseau, the standard edition of all of Rousseau's major writings and many of his minor ones. All of his minor ones, or just many of them?
Just about all.
Just about all. Just about all. Translated into English. In seeing this mammoth project through to completion, Dr. Kelly has performed an extraordinary service to Anglophone students of Rousseau, for which we are all very grateful. As a student of Rousseau myself, I can say that my understanding of this most paradoxical and elusive philosopher would be much the poorer were it not for the many things I have learned from Christopher Kelly. And I have no doubt that all our understandings of Rousseau are about to be enriched still more by the lecture with which Dr. Kelly has generously agreed to favor us this evening, The Enigmas of Rousseau, Judge of Jean-Jacques. So without further ado, please join me now in welcoming Dr. Kelly.
Thank you very much, Zach. You referred to me as an expert on Rousseau. At Boston College, we used to have a lecture series, and it was a priest called Ernest Fortin who often introduced people. And he once introduced someone saying that our speaker tonight is an expert on the subject he's speaking on. You all know what an expert is. That's someone from out of town. I qualify very much as someone from out of town here, so I guess that means I'm an expert on Rousseau. I have visited Michigan State a couple of times in the past, once under the auspices of the Refract Forum, and I think I know, well, everyone who has been a director or co-director or founder of the forum, and an admirer of their work and the history of this organization. I also see a couple of former Boston College graduate students in the audience, so I feel very much at home, even though I am an expert from out of town. I'm going to be talking about the least known and the least liked of Rousseau's works. And I'll begin by trying to situate it, saying a lot of things that people know about Rousseau, and then perhaps some things that are less well known. Although he led an eventful life from the time he ran away from Geneva at the age of 15, Rousseau had little success as a writer until he was almost 40 years old. With the publication of his Discourse on the Sciences of the Arts in 1751, however, he became a literary celebrity almost overnight. This celebrity was fueled by the controversy over the discourse, in which writers from much of Europe wrote to defend the sciences and the arts against Rousseau's attack. His responses to some of his opponents stirred the controversy up even more. The next year, while the controversy was still raging, he had a stunning success as a composer with his opera, The Village Soothsayer, which really became the most performed French opera of the 18th century. This extended his fame to a new area, and this only increased with a fresh controversy over the merits of French and Italian music. By the end of 1753, even before the publication of the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, he was one of the most famous writers in Europe. I think perhaps at that point second to Voltaire among French writers. Montesquieu was still alive, so third to Voltaire and Montesquieu. By this point, anything he published was met with great interest. The peak of his literary fame came from the end of 1760 until the end of May 1762. During this brief period, Rousseau published Julie, which became the best-selling novel of the century in Europe, On the Social Contract, and Emile. There are few examples in history of such a series of works in such a short period of time. After publishing little of note for the first almost 40 years of his life, in just over 1 decade, Rousseau produced an astonishing quantity of works of the highest merit and in very diverse forms. Novels, operas, treatises, discourses, a fairy tale, you name it. At this point, his situation changed radically in the middle of 1762. With the publication of On the Social Contract, and especially Émile, Rousseau was forced to flee country after country as his books were banned by public authorities and attacked by clerical authorities. Even mobs were incited to attack him. Reports that he was once walking down the street and a man saw him and turned to his wife and said, "There he is, where's my gun?" Rousseau defended himself with important publications over the 3 years after the publication of Émile, then all but gave up writing for publication for the rest of his life. Of course, his fame had not disappeared, and he had not stopped writing for posthumous publication. It was well known that he was writing his Confessions, and this work was eagerly read when it appeared in 2 installments in the decade after his death. The same was true for the Reveries of the Solitary Walker, which was unfinished when Rousseau died in 1778 and published several years later. Everyone read these works. They were excited to know about them. They were quickly recognized as masterpieces of French literature. His Considerations on the Government of Poland was also fairly quickly published, both in his collected writings and in a separate edition. There were, however, 2 significant works that were published along with these after Rousseau's death that did not attract the same attention. They were published in collected writings, not in separate editions of their own. They continued to appear in editions of Rousseau's collected writings into the 19th century and beyond, but were not published in separate editions until late in the 20th century. Although we can't know for sure, there's no evidence that many people read them at all. The first of these is the Essay on the Origin of Languages, which Rousseau had prepared for possible publication in 1761, which was a casualty of the controversy over Émile and did not appear until after his death. After a long period of neglect by all but a few scholars, this work was brought to attention by Jacques Derrida's De la Grammatologie in 1967. Since then, it has been studied and written about just about as much as any of Rousseau's works. It's become extremely popular. The other work with which I will be concerned today is Rousseau, Judge of Jean-Jacques, Dialogues. This is, in fact, the last work that Rousseau completed, since the Reveries as well as the Confessions remained unfinished. One might think that this status as Rousseau's final work, just think, famous writer, he's dead, his last finished work appears, isn't everyone going to be interested? One would think that it would attract immediate attention, but it didn't. I think there are at least 2 reasons for this. One of them accidental and one more essential. The first is that when it was first published, it was classified as an autobiographical work. It was even called a memoir by its editors, and it was published along with the Confessions and Reveries. But it doesn't really meet any of the expectations that readers bring to memoirs or autobiographies. It's dialogues, first of all, and dialogues of a very peculiar form. So it wasn't what people expected given the billing it received. The second reason is that however one classifies it, this work is a very peculiar one. To such a degree that it is most often cited as evidence of Rousseau's insanity. It did not appear in an edition by itself until 1962, and it was published along with an introduction by Michel Foucault, which gave it some attention, but until very recently it remained relatively unstudied and unread. The work's strangeness appears in a simple description. It consists of 3 dialogues between 2 characters. One of them is named Rousseau, but he's not exactly Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the author of this work. Rather, he is Jean-Jacques Rousseau as he would have been if he had read the works rather than writing them. The other character is identified simply as a Frenchman. In the first dialogue, he has not read the works because he's been persuaded that their author, called simply Jean-Jacques, so we have Rousseau, and we have Jean-Jacques, two different people, is a wicked criminal. In short, the three dialogues are concerned with the relationship between the books and the reputation of the author. Even more strangely, in the second dialogue, the character Rousseau reports that he has paid a visit to Jean-Jacques, and one of the things he has learned is that Jean-Jacques is writing a book, which is a series of dialogues about the misunderstanding of his works. So one character goes to visit another character and learns that that character is writing a book in which the two of them both appear. So it is a very strange book, right? There are other strange things. Something similar happens in Don Quixote, and if you think about Platonic dialogues, like Theaetetus, we have Theaetetus, a character who looks like Socrates, but isn't Socrates, whose best friend is someone named Socrates, who also isn't Socrates, and the subject of the dialogue is in some way sameness and difference, right? So Rousseau's not the only person to do this sort of playful thing with characters, but nonetheless, it's odd. People have found it a particularly repellent work because of this oddness and because of some of the things that are said in it. Because the work argues that Jean-Jacques has been the innocent victim of a massive conspiracy of intellectuals and the powerful, readers have tended to see it as an indication of Jean-Jacques Rousseau's paranoia. And I'm going to try to, when I refer to Rousseau, I'm talking about the character. When I refer to Jean-Jacques about the character, and I'll try to refer to Jean-Jacques Rousseau when I'm talking about the author. But it's impossible to do that consistently. I'm going to argue, however, that in spite of its strangeness, because of it, this is an important work that clarifies major themes of Jean-Jacques Rousseau's works, and that it sheds important light on the issue of the public defense of a way of life that seems inexplicable to most people. In this latter respect, it can best be compared to Plato's Apology of Socrates. I begin with the fact that readers have not found Rousseau, Judge of Jean-Jacques, easy to understand. This is all the more interesting because its most overt theme is the misunderstanding that the public has had about both Jean-Jacques' books and himself. It has proven to be especially difficult to understand what Rousseau has to say about misunderstanding. His concern with this issue, however, did not begin with this work. The continuity of this late work with his earlier work can be seen in his choice of an epigraph. In some, but not all of the manuscripts, there's several manuscripts of this work, Rousseau begins with a quotation from Ovid, "Here I am the barbarian because no one understands me." It's a variant of a line from Ovid's Tristia. And Ovid writes about his exile to a barbarian land where the inhabitants do not understand Latin. So Ovid is a sophisticated poet who lives far from his audience, among people incapable of becoming his audience, because they don't understand Latin and he doesn't understand whatever predecessor of Bulgarian they speak where he is. So Rousseau presents himself as being something like Ovid in this case. Now this is a passage, this line from Ovid had drawn Rousseau's attention long before he used it as an epigraph to Rousseau, Judge of Jean-Jacques. Some of you will recognize it as the epigraph of the first discourse, but he used it even before that, 10 years before that. The first occasion that we know of Rousseau using this remark occurred in 1742, when he was 29 years old. He was living a provincial existence, and he wrote to a friend about his reading of philosophic and poetic literature, Leibniz and Pope in particular. After a lengthy discussion in which he demonstrates his learning and intelligence, Rousseau concludes, "I hope, sir, that in taking my frankness in the sense in which I offer it to you, it will have nothing that displeases you, and that you will pardon it, a man who speaks from experience and who numerous times had the occasion to say, like Ovid among the Sarmatians, 'Here I'm the barbarian because no one understands me.'" In other words, Rousseau identifies himself as a poet who lives among people too unsophisticated to understand him. In short, he's like many young men before and since, who see themselves as misunderstood and unappreciated by those hicks among whom they live, and long to be removed from their exile with a sophisticated, intelligent audience that could appreciate them for what they were. Right? Shortly after writing this, Rousseau made his way to Paris, where he hoped to achieve fame from a more sophisticated audience. So the young man or woman from the provinces who longs for the cosmopolitan city is a common theme in literature and life before Rousseau and certainly after Rousseau. So, as I said, Rousseau used this same epigraph in 1751 when he published the work that finally did make him famous, Discourse on the Sciences and the Arts. Here, however, I think there's an entirely new element in his use of the epigraph. He's now been living among the sophisticated Parisians for a number of years, with a short period in sophisticated and cosmopolitan Venice. So the sophisticated people of the world have had ample opportunity to get to know him. It's no longer unsophisticated people from the provinces who mistakenly see Rousseau as even more barbaric than they are. It's now the learned and sophisticated readers of Paris and the academies of France whom Rousseau accuses by anticipation of misunderstanding. He begins the discourse by saying, no one's going to understand this work. He was right. He predicts that his criticism of the arts and science will be mistakenly understood as coming from an ignorant barbarism rather than from a profound and intelligent analysis that makes Parisian sophisticates look like barbarians. In fact, an essential part of the argument of the discourse is that societies characterized by the promotion of the sciences and the arts fail to understand themselves. Rousseau, and now I'm talking about Jean-Jacques Rousseau, first puts the issue in terms of what an inhabitant of some faraway land would think about European morals on the basis of external appearances. He says that such a foreigner would guess our morals to be exactly the opposite of what they are. We talk good morals, but we don't act good morals. Here the issue seems to be the ability of the Europeans to deceive others, but Rousseau's analysis makes it clear that the Europeans also tend to think of themselves as morally superior to others because of their learning and mastery of the arts. As Rousseau says in a second epigraph, also from the Roman poet, Horace, we are deceived by the appearance of right. It's not just we deceive others by appearing to be right. What the sciences and the arts do is to spread a deceiving appearance that fools both outsiders and insiders. To be sure, sophisticated people can see through these false appearances to a degree, but this does not stop them from congratulating themselves for their moral superiority. When the Academy of Dijon posed its question, has the restoration of the sciences and arts tended to purify morals, it rightly assumed that most contestants would answer positive. In fact, only one other person answered negative. Rousseau's use of Ovid in this context, and his use of Horace, indicates that his audience, living in the impression that the sciences and arts support morality, will fail to understand his argument for the opposite position. In fact, this very misunderstanding is evidence of the truth of his position. By using the same epigraph 25 years later in the last work he completed, Rousseau indicates the continuing importance of the theme of misunderstanding for his work. So I'll now turn my attention directly to Rousseau, Judge of Jean-Jacques. The enigmatic character of this work is underscored by the fact that near the beginning of each of the three dialogues One or the other of the two characters identifies an enigma or puzzle in what the other has been saying. So I not only say it's an enigmatic work, but each of the characters says, here's an enigma. Right? The existence of these enigmas highlights the importance of the theme of the difficulty of understanding for the work. I'm going to try to explain the three enigmas to show the unity of the work, or at least to explain how it proceeds. The first dialogue begins in the midst of things, with the character Rousseau's exclamation, "What incredible things I have just learned." So we haven't heard what those are. "I can't get over it. No, I will never get over it. Just heaven, what an abominable man, how he has hurt me, how I am going to detest him." What he has just learned, it turns out, is that Jean-Jacques, whose books he admires so much, has been proven to be a scoundrel of the worst sort, a criminal, even a monster. Rousseau is a reader of a particular sort, and the Frenchman, his friend, will reveal himself to be a reader of a somewhat different sort. For Rousseau, the relation between the character of the author and his work is crucial. This is why he is so disoriented by the revelation that Jean-Jacques is a proven criminal. To be sure, he concedes that a scoundrel can be a talented writer, but denies that he can produce the sort of works that have moved him so much. I mean, incidentally, I'll mention this is a problem with our reading of everyone. You know, whenever we read something by a famous author that we haven't read before, we have ideas about what we're going to find in that book that come from the reputation of the author. If we're told that the author is a scoundrel and a monster, we're not likely to read the works with appreciation. On the other hand, if we're told that the author is a wonderful human being, we're more open, although perhaps closed off in a different way to what it has to say. But in any case, we have from the character Rousseau a very personal connection he felt with the author. And that's why it upsets him to learn that the author is not what he thought he was. The greater significance of this very personal account of reading is indicated later, just before a turning point in the discussion of the first dialogue, when Rousseau gives a sort of autobiographical account of himself. This account gives him a more specific identity as a character, and in some important way shows the ways that he is like, but not simply identical to Jean-Jacques or to Jean-Jacques Rousseau. This account indicates both his fundamental concerns and the source of his interest in the writings of Jean-Jacques. He is, to begin with, a foreigner. That's why this reputation has come as a surprise. Who has read the books attributed to Jean-Jacques. Moreover, he began his life in poverty, becoming successful only to learn that worldly success does not bring happiness. This experience, which included a disillusionment about the sweet chimera of friendship, led him to a period of despondency. Nevertheless, withdrawal into himself led him to a dependence on religious faith as a source of happiness that had two components. First, he says, "I tasted an infinite sweetness in the thought that I was not alone." The belief that there is a divine witness to his unhappiness is a consolation. He adds that his belief taught him that his hardships were limited and that he could hope for the compensation and joys of a better state. In short, he believes in a personal God and in his providence. By itself, however, this faith proves to be insufficient for reasons that are not entirely clear. Rousseau found the necessary supplement to it in the books of Jean-Jacques. He found in Jean-Jacques a kindred soul. The fact that such a person exists seems to serve the same function as God understood as a sympathetic witness to undeserved suffering. Rousseau adds that the writings taught him to find in himself the enjoyment and happiness that all others seek so far from themselves. He does not explain here the relation between anticipating a better state and seeking happiness inside oneself. However this may be, and I'll return to this question, Rousseau found that his reading strengthened his belief against the derision of free thinkers. He declares, "I was a believer. I have always been. although he later goes out of his way to insist that he does not believe in miracles. In sum, Rousseau is interested in Jean-Jacques because he finds in his writings a solution to the problem of his own unhappy experience. The connection between his professed religious beliefs and his discussion of Jean-Jacques in the second dialogue turns out to be very significant. Rousseau's account of his reading stresses the close personal bond among the author, his works, and his readers. He finds it impossible to believe that this author can be a wicked man. This leads him to insist both that he believes the charges against Jean-Jacques and that he knows that the author of the books is no criminal. This is the first enigma. This causes the Frenchman to say, "As for me, I understand nothing of these enigmas. I beg you to tell me, for once, your true feelings about it." Rousseau then offers what he calls the key to the enigma. To the many crimes committed by Jean-Jacques, he adds the additional one of claiming to be the author of books that were in fact written by someone else, a good man. So this is becoming dizzy. The real author of the books is the anonymous good man admired by Rousseau, while Jean-Jacques is a plagiarist on top of his other crimes. Readers who are already confused by the division of Jean-Jacques Rousseau into the characters of Rousseau and Jean-Jacques are faced with a new division between Jean-Jacques, the monster, and whoever wrote these books, unnamed person. Rousseau's enigma is an attempt to save the books from their association with a proven criminal. As the dialogue proceeds, Rousseau and the Frenchman address the implications of this enigma, the split between the purported author and the books. The discussion of Jean-Jacques' character and his treatment by his accusers leads to a crucial turning point a little over halfway through the discussion. It becomes clear that while there's abundant reason to believe that Jean-Jacques is the monster he is described to be, he has never in fact been formally convicted of any crime. For Rousseau, this changes everything. He declares, "Oh, thank heaven, I'm relieved. You remove a heavy burden from my heart." In explaining himself, he undertakes an elaborate and precise discussion of a fundamental principle of Jean-Jacques Rousseau's political thought, one that he had never been as explicit about before. It could seem strange that the lack of a formal conviction would mean so much to Rousseau, given that he continues to concede the force of the proofs that have been provided of Jean-Jacques' wickedness. His position turns on the distinction between these proofs, which can produce a persuasion of guilt, and genuine evidence that would be necessary to turn this persuasion into conviction in all senses of the term. Right? Conviction of the truth and conviction of the criminal. A part of his insistence comes from examples he gives of trials in which the accused was found to be innocent in spite of apparently overwhelming proofs against him, with sudden revelations and so on. Most importantly, he argues, as long as the accused has not been heard, the proofs that condemn him, however strong they might be, however convincing they might appear, lack the seal that can show them to be so. Indeed, he goes so far as to refer to this great principle as the basis and sanction of all justice, without which human society would crumble at its foundations. He repeatedly calls this principle of hearing the defense of the accused sacred or holy, and claims that both the maintenance of the social order and the preservation of the human race depend on it. The force with which Rousseau insists upon this great principle indicates that its significance extends far beyond the specific instance involving Jean-Jacques. In effect, Rousseau turns his attention to the formal requirements of a general legal condemnation. It's the presence of a public hearing in which the accused can answer charges that transforms proofs into legal evidence. And persuasion into conviction. Only the latter is sufficient to convict someone of a crime. Now, the emphasis upon this sacred principle is an extension of a position staked out by Montesquieu. In the spirit of the laws, Montesquieu argues that the establishment of political liberty in the constitution of a state by itself is not sufficient to guarantee the liberty of citizens, which depends principally on criminal laws, not governmental institutions. He says that this subject interests the human race more than any other thing there is in the world. So both he and Rousseau regard this as an extremely important matter. Although Montesquieu's primary subject is the reform of punishments, he begins his discussion with the issue of witnesses. Among his examples is King Clotaire of the Franks, who made a law so that an accused could not be condemned without being heard. The fact that such a law was made by Clotaire indicates that it had not been a universal practice before. So Rousseau, our character, makes this into a fundamental principle of human society. He radicalizes Montesquieu's already significance on this point. I'll mention that this is not an issue alien to us. We're used to people being convicted in the court of public opinion without being given a hearing. This has become a more and more common phenomenon. And we could say that Rousseau presents himself as a prime victim of cancel culture in this work. So, having established the fundamental point that Jean-Jacques has not really been shown to be a monster, he's not been convicted, Rousseau insists that it is necessary to find out what he can say in his defense. At the end of the first dialogue, the two interlocutors agree that Rousseau will seek out Jean-Jacques, and that the Frenchman will read the books he has hitherto been unwilling to look at because of the author's reputation as a monster. The second dialogue consists of Rousseau's report about his visit, and the third consists of the Frenchman's report about his reading. The second dialogue begins with the announcement of the enigma to be explained in this dialogue. So, again, this is an enigma. Rousseau reports that he has found Jean-Jacques to be neither a virtuous man nor a detestable scoundrel. To this, the Frenchman replies, "But then what is all this? You're discouraging with your perpetual enigmas. He's got to be one or the other. Is he virtuous or is he vicious? Is he a monster or is he a good man? What is it?" Once again, the dialogue begins with a puzzle, the key to which needs to be explained. The Frenchman's reaction indicates that he thinks someone must be either virtuous or vicious, and that there is no simple middle ground between the two, although of course there could be degrees, but there's nothing that's neither virtue. The account of Jean-Jacques as good but not virtuous provides a new moral doctrine that can give an explanation of Jean-Jacques' otherwise admittedly incomprehensible life, the life that makes him appear to be a monster to himself. So now we get a treatment of what's the most famous part of Rousseau's, Jean-Jacques Rousseau's teaching, natural goodness. Jean-Jacques is someone who is good but not virtuous, but also not a monster. This dialogue abounds in terms to characterize Jean-Jacques' iniquity, terms such as scoundrel or criminal, but monster is the crowning insult. A monster is not only wicked, but is characterized by a wickedness that has no natural explanation. A thief may be motivated by a natural desire. Everybody likes to have money. We can understand the natural desire to have money. The thief is unjust in taking it from other people. But what he does is intelligent. It's a natural desire. But Jean-Jacques' wickedness defies explanation in natural terms. In Diderot's Encyclopedia, monsters are described as departures from natural occurrences, either by lacking essential parts or having excessive parts. The example given to illustrate this is an animal born with two heads. That's a monster. Later in the third dialogue, the Frenchman will say of Jean-Jacques, if D'Alembert or Diderot, the two editors of the Encyclopedia, took it upon themselves today to affirm that he has two heads, everyone who saw him pass on the street tomorrow would see his two heads very distinctly. Monster. The moral rather than physical monstrosity attributed to Jean-Jacques is one explanation of the strange way he lives his life. Rousseau provides an alternative one that indicates that a proper understanding of nature provides an explanation of Jean-Jacques and implies that his accusers are the monsters, not him. In short, the enigma concerns the concept of natural goodness, a concept which will prove to be the fundamental principle of Jean-Jacques' system, as said in the third dialogue, the Frenchman. What Rousseau learns from his meeting with Jean-Jacques, who embodies this principle, the Frenchman later learns from his reading without meeting Jean-Jacques. And we can all learn by reading Emile or the Second Discourse. Prior to the encounter with either Jean-Jacques or his system, virtue and vice seem to be understood as the frame of reference for morality. Anyone who lacks virtue must possess vice. Jean-Jacques both represents in his person and demonstrates in his writings an entirely new way of looking at things. In order to understand Rousseau's depiction of Jean-Jacques, it's important to keep in mind his autobiographical account of his own character that I referred to earlier in the first dialogue. We've seen that he's troubled by the unhappiness of innocent people and that he has looked for answers to this problem in religion and in his reading of Jean-Jacques. It's not surprising that once he has succeeded in meeting Jean-Jacques, Rousseau questions him about the matters he treats in his books. Rousseau gives a list of their topics of conversation, saying, I sounded him out on the nature of the soul, on the existence of God, on the morality of human life, on true happiness, on his thoughts about the doctrine and fashion and its authors, in short, on everything that can make known, along with a man's true feelings about the use of this life and its destination, his true principles of conduct. That's a good list of questions to ask if you meet someone. Given Rousseau's autobiographical account of the first dialogue, it's not surprising that the nature of the soul and the existence of God are of particular importance, along with the use of this life and its destination. These subjects correspond precisely to what he has said about himself. A crucial part of his account of Jean-Jacques' goodness involves a comparison of him with examples of virtue, a variety of types of examples. As we've seen, Rousseau's second enigma insists that Jean-Jacques is neither vicious nor virtuous. By far the longest portion of this part of the second dialogue consists of a lengthy treatment of Jean-Jacques in relation to what can be found in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, in the book of Matthew in the New Testament. This is particularly important because it relates to Rousseau's autobiographical account in the first dialogue of what led him to be attracted to Jean-Jacques. As I've indicated, his faith in a witness to his innocent suffering and the promise of a reward in a future state played a crucial role in leading to his response to Jean-Jacques' writing. Given that Rousseau listed the subject of the existence of God as one of the matters he discussed with Jean-Jacques, it is not surprising that they would address religious matters. Although unfortunately, Rousseau reports nothing directly about what Jean-Jacques said to him about the specific topic of the existence of God. The confrontation of the goodness of Jean-Jacques with the teaching of the Sermon on the Mount begins with a quite specific reference to the gospel text in the precise context of explaining the nature of goodness. Rousseau says about Jean-Jacques, he can truly say, in contrast to those people in the gospel and those in our day, that where his heart is, there too is his treasure. This harkens back to Rousseau's autobiographical statement in the first dialogue, in which he says that reading Jean-Jacques' books taught him to find within himself the enjoyment and happiness that all others seek so far from themselves. Now we learn that there's a relation between this teaching and that of Jesus. In Matthew 6, Jesus criticizes a certain type of person, saying, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moths and vermin destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourself treasures in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy, where thieves do not break in and steal. Jesus and Jean-Jacques share their criticism of such people who, as Rousseau says here, exist both today and at the time of the gospel, people who put their treasure in this earth. Nevertheless, there's an important distinction between the two positions. Jesus concludes, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So put your treasure in heaven, not here. In short, both Jesus and those being criticized by him put their hearts where their treasure is. They mistakenly put their treasure on earth, their hearts on earth, their treasure on earth, and therefore their hearts there. He puts his treasure in heaven. They differ in the location. Jean-Jacques, however, insists that his treasure is in his heart, rather than something external on earth or in heaven. In this respect, Jesus counts as one of those people of the gospel with whom Jean-Jacques is in contrast. Is it not true, however, one might ask, that Jean-Jacques lives with a hopefulness directed toward a reward in heaven, as Rousseau has said that he himself did? Shortly before this passage, Rousseau had indicated as much by appealing to providence and nature alike, saying of Jean-Jacques, divested by cruel hands of all the goods of this life, hope compensates him for them in the future. Imagination gives them back to him in the present. In this condition, he rejects earthly goods. Much later in this dialogue, Rousseau returns to this issue with greater precision. First, he says, leaping forward sometimes into the future for which he hopes, and which he feels is his due, he tries to draw for himself its delights by comparing them to the ills he has been made to suffer unjustly in this world. Notice again, leaping forward sometimes into the future. Sometimes, then, Jean-Jacques finds himself agreeing with Jesus and puts his treasure in heaven, in the future, letting his heart follow it there. Rousseau's account of Jean-Jacques does not stop there, however. He immediately adds, more often. Letting his senses collaborate with his fictions, he forms beings in accordance with his heart, and living with them in a society of which he feels worthy, he soars to the highest heaven. In this part of the passage, it appears that using his heart as his guide, Jean-Jacques attains heavenly rewards here and now, apparently without the aid of providence. Since Rousseau is concerned with Jean-Jacques' constant manner of being, rather than more temporary states, it appears necessary to conclude that he most consistently rejects Jesus' exhortation, even while his distress sometimes causes him to lapse. Immediately after the reference to the Sermon on the Mount, Rousseau gives a straightforward account of Jean-Jacques' goodness. He says that Jean-Jacques can be considered to be either strong or weak, depending on how one regards him. On the one hand, his will is so constant that it cannot be swayed by all the powers of the universe. So strong is he that it appears that neither man nor God is capable of swaying his devotion to his good. On the other hand, although he cannot be diverted, he does often lack the vigor to obtain his goal. His goodness consists in a certain steadfastness of will or vision, not in a capacity to satisfy his will. He's never swayed from the goal of goodness, even though he can't attain it. His own goodness. This explains the paradox of goodness, which is neither vice nor virtue. As Rousseau says a few pages later, he would do good because it would be sweet for him to do so. He hastens to add, but if it were a matter of fighting his fondest desires and breaking his heart to fulfill his duty, would he do that also? I doubt it. Virtue, as opposed to goodness, involves something different from a steadfast devotion to one's good. It requires a willingness and ability to overcome one's fondest desires, even to the point of breaking one's heart. This requires something more than the voice of nature. Rousseau says there must be another voice that commands, and nature must remain silent. Although this picture will be qualified slightly in what follows, it invites the view that virtue and faith and providence go together. Providence provides the other voice that commands, and it also provides the hope for compensation that will allow one to overcome one's fondest desires even when this threatens to break one's heart. Goodness, however, would never allow one willingly to break one's heart by renouncing one's fondest desire. The strongest evidence about whether Jean-Jacques pays heed to such a commanding voice that commands virtue, also comes in the confrontation with the Sermon on the Mount. There is one point on which Rousseau insists that Jean-Jacques does endorse at least one part of the sermon without equivocation. He says, "I doubt whether another mortal has ever said better and more sincerely to God, 'Thy will be done.'" In the sincerity of his endorsement of the essential teaching of the Lord's Prayer, Jean-Jacques is apparently at least the equal of any Christian who has ever lived. Declaring one's submission to divine will would seem to involve obeying any of the commandments that come from the divine voice, however. Nevertheless, Rousseau is equally certain that Jean-Jacques is indifferent to every one of the more specific commands given in the sermon. For example, more than once, Jesus insists on the importance of pardoning those who have trespassed against one. Rousseau refers to the great but difficult virtue of pardoning one's enemies, but he denies that Jean-Jacques practices this virtue. Instead, he simply does not think about his enemies unless he's compelled to. Rousseau attributes this to the fact that Jean-Jacques is too avid for his own good to have time to think about the ill of another. In other words, the strength of his natural goodness preserves him against the desire for vengeance, which would waste his time. But it also prevents him from overcoming his own desires for the sake of benefiting his neighbor. He does no harm, not in answer to a commandment from a divine voice, but because he's too lazy to be concerned about it. In sum, the most that can be said about Jean-Jacques and religious belief is that he intermittently worries about a compensation for his innocent suffering, but his more constant manner of being leaves him indifferent to this and inattentive to any command from the divine voice. Again, his most distinctive characteristic is his avidity for his own good. If Jean-Jacques ignores the command to pardon those who trespass against him, it is even more true that he fails to ask forgiveness for his own trespasses. This is only partially because his unique attention to his own good keeps him from desiring to inflict harm on others. His weakness in the pursuit of his good, and perhaps that pursuit itself, means that he is not altogether immune from vices, including those that entail harm to others. These vices, however, are never characterized as sins. The desire for independence that characterizes Jean-Jacques' goodness apparently turns him away from any sort of dependence upon God's forgiveness. There is one additional indirect reference to the sermon that can complete this confrontation. Rousseau makes it clear that beyond wishing for his daily bread, Jean-Jacques is eager to live in a modest comfort that goes beyond the daily bread. He sees no need to restrict himself to a more austere life. His pursuit of his own good extends beyond the merely necessary. His acceptance of the divine will would not include a rejection of these comforts if he can hope to obtain them by his own efforts. In sum, Rousseau finds support for his own faith in both his reading of and conversation with Jean-Jacques. He reports Jean-Jacques' partial agreement with Jesus' criticism of those who seek their happiness in worldly goods, and insists that he embraces the maxim, "Thy will be done." Nevertheless, his account of their meetings clearly indicates, to me at least, that his hero balks at any notion of a divine commandment that would oblige him to forsake his own good. Even his hopes for a compensation for his innocent suffering arise only occasionally. After treating the goodness of Jean-Jacques in relation to the Sermon on the Mount, Rousseau turns his attention to contrasting him to souls of high caliber or truly wise men, and then to the genuinely virtuous. So there's two different types: truly wise men who are souls of high caliber, and then the genuinely virtuous, which are apparently not the same. About the former, he says, true wise men are cold. Being untouched by passions, they cannot really be considered to be virtuous, because they have no need to overcome their passions to do what is right. In this respect, they are both like and unlike those phlegmatic and cold people whose sole passion of amour-propre makes them hateful, vindictive, and implacable. They are like them in being cold, but unlike them in lacking amour-propre. They can be moral out of principle, but they do not deserve credit for it. Like the wise, Jean-Jacques is largely immune to amour-propre, but unlike them, apparently, he is warm in the pursuit of his own good in a way that prevents him from following just principles without effort. The genuinely virtuous, this other category, represents a different type. Like Jean-Jacques, they may be warm, but they know how to govern their hearts and passions. Unlike Rousseau, they do not even require a witness to their suffering if they do suffer. In the end, Rousseau has explained the enigma of Jean-Jacques' failure to be either virtuous or vicious. He has explained the enigma of natural goodness and has done so largely by distinguishing it from the demands of Christianity. The third dialogue follows the pattern set by the other two, beginning with an enigma. This time it's the Frenchman, however, who proposes it. He's returned from the country and is ready to give his report on his experience of reading Jean-Jacques. This time it is Rousseau who makes the accusation against the Frenchman, who has said that his close reading of Jean-Jacques' works have revealed the irremediable crimes that couldn't have failed to make their author the most odious of monsters and the horror of the human race. To this, Rousseau replies, "Is it really you talking? Is it your turn to make enigmas?" The basic enigma of this final dialogue centers on the nature and significance of the persecution undergone by Jean-Jacques. The first two dialogues are concerned with the misunderstanding of Jean-Jacques. The third is concerned with the meaning and consequences of this misunderstanding. One of the important features of this final dialogue is that in it the character of the Frenchman comes into his own. Earlier, he had resisted, but ultimately accepted the positions of Rousseau, very grudgingly. If one did not look closely at the intelligence of his resistance, one might see him as merely a straw man who exists only to be refuted. Now, when he disagrees on questions such as the nature of the hatred of Jean-Jacques and how he and his supporters should behave, his arguments cause shifts in Rousseau's positions. So, the Frenchman starts to get the better of the other. The effect of the Frenchman's reading has been to teach him that Jean-Jacques is a profound and systematic thinker. While Rousseau stressed his sense of a strong personal connection with the author, without denying this, the Frenchman focuses on the effort needed to understand the works. Rousseau seemed to just understand them immediately. Rousseau has explained the goodness of the man Jean-Jacques. The Frenchman explains how a close reading of the books teaches the reader about the great principle that nature made man happy and good, but that society depraves him and makes him miserable. In other words, both interlocutors are concerned with the meaning of natural goodness, but they approach it in rather different ways. The importance of the Frenchman's reading is that it reflects a possibility available to all readers to come who are unable to imitate Rousseau by paying a call on the author in person. So the Frenchman is like us, but smarter. The enigma that Rousseau finds in the Frenchman's opening statement, that there is nothing surprising in the fact that Jean-Jacques is regarded as a monster, shows a disagreement between the two. For the Frenchman, the fact that the writing exposed the pretensions of powerful members of society, such as intellectuals, doctors, kings, the rich, and others, makes it natural that these offended parties would strike back. The only surprising thing is that Jean-Jacques would have thought he could write with impunity. To this, Rousseau replies that Jean-Jacques did indeed expect that the powerful would persecute him. He expected persecution of all kinds because this is always the fate of those who are bold enough to expose the truth about the powerful. What he did not expect and could not have expected is dishonor, opprobrium, and defamation on top of persecution. These elements of his fate have other causes, which Rousseau says are more secret, more fortuitous, more ridiculous. While it may be true that the classes of people exposed by Jean-Jacques were predisposed to organize against him, the leaders of the conspiracy are motivated by a more personal antipathy that predated Jean-Jacques' literary career. Although Rousseau, judge of Jean-Jacques, never abandons Rousseau's position completely, it is important to see that the Frenchman's position comes closer to that presented by Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the Discourse on the Sciences and the Arts. That work does claim to present a universal thesis, that corruption and the influence of the sciences and the arts always go hand in hand. Moreover, it presents examples of individuals like Socrates, the elder Cato, and Rousseau himself, Jean-Jacques Rousseau himself, who stand against a powerful prejudice in favor of the sciences and arts. There are ways, however, in which the contemporary situation is presented as distinct in the discourse. First, the invention of the printing press means that dangerous teachings have a greater public impact. More important for our purposes here is a distinction between the way the opponents of the sciences and arts are treated today. Jean-Jacques Rousseau says in the Discourse, "Among us it is true, Socrates would not have drunk the hemlock, but he would have drunk from an even more bitter cup, insulting ridicule and scorn 100 times worse than death." That didn't happen to him while he was alive. Now it would. The question considered by the Frenchman concerns why ridicule and scorn, in addition to simple persecution, are the fate of people who dare to tell the truth in modern times. When he hears Rousseau's claim that the conspiracy against Jean-Jacques originated before he became famous, and that it has fortuitous and even ridiculous causes, apparently of a personal nature, the Frenchman does not object. He does, however, reply that whatever might be true about the original causes, the effects are more easily intelligible. Ultimately, his explanation is connected with an account of a transformation of the operation of public opinion in modern times. He says, "Among the peculiarities that distinguish our century from all others is the methodical and consistent spirit that has guided public opinion for 20 years. Of course, public opinion has always existed. But in the past, it was arbitrary and subject to random changes as passions varied. Now, however, a philosophic sect, let's call it the Enlightenment, has organized itself into a body. This sect has allied itself in a somewhat unsteady alliance with the powerful. Together, they exercise a much more consistent domination of public opinion than has hitherto been the case. They lead opinion through the dissemination of doctrines that are chosen less for their truth than their usefulness in embedding this project of ruling." In effect, the Frenchman presents what we know as the Enlightenment as the effort of intellectuals to shape public opinion to guarantee their own influence. They promote doctrines that help to guarantee that. Perhaps one could find similar phenomena today. A part of the drama of the third dialogue is shown by the effect of the Frenchman's diagnosis on his friend Rousseau. To be sure, Rousseau never explicitly abandons his claim that the plot against Jean-Jacques has a personal origin. Nevertheless, he ultimately builds on the Frenchman's claims that the plot is connected to a more comprehensive attempt to replace the influence of Christianity with the influence of the new philosophers. He maintains the significance of Jean-Jacques by saying that the preaching of the new doctrine began with the plot against Jean-Jacques, but concedes that it appears to be related to other plots, of which this one is only a piece. In the end, the Frenchman and Rousseau agree that nothing less than the political and moral fate of Europe is concerned in the struggle between Jean-Jacques and his persecutors. As is so often the case for Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the most personal of issues are tightly bound with ones of general significance. So we can now understand the conspiracy. And this is the thing that people think shows that Rousseau is crazy. As I've indicated, modern life is characterized by an attempt to rule the world by making public opinion a more consistent, more easily dominated force, or putting it differently, more rational force, influenced by intellectuals. The power of Jean-Jacques' writings consists in both their exposure of the sinister character of this effort and their presentation of an alternative view of human nature, a view that is not compatible either with the new philosophy or the Christianity that preceded it. Having no refutation for Jean-Jacques' systematic understanding, Indeed, having little concern with the truth, the philosophic inquisition, as it's called by Rousseau now, attacks him with the weapons it has ready to hand, ridicule and defamation. There is one other issue upon which Rousseau and the Frenchman begin by disagreeing. From the first dialogue on, Rousseau insists that publicizing Jean-Jacques' situation is both a moral obligation and furthermore is bound to be effective. Rousseau appeals to what he calls the generally accepted axiom that the truth is uncovered sooner or later. He's a very hopeful person. Accepting this axiom, he wants to help it to be discovered sooner. In any event, he believes that a providential history is on Jean-Jacques and justice's side. He presents this as his personal opinion without indicating whether Jean-Jacques shares it. He thinks the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. He doesn't say that, but that's what he believes. The Frenchman, however, is much more cautious, and I think more sensible. He says, I would judge that multitudes of characters and events described in history may have no other basis than the invention of those who took it upon themselves to affirm them. The fact that the truth ultimately comes out in some cases does not allow one to conclude that it always does. How do we know how many important historical truths remain buried? In fact, the new modern efforts to exercise control over public opinion might well make these revelations less likely in the future. Accordingly, he's unwilling to behave boldly because he thinks it is dangerous and of doubtful success. In the end, his prudence and caution win the day against Rousseau's zeal. Although Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the author of this book, insists that he has a duty to do what he can to rescue his reputation, even though he has little hope that he can do so. I now conclude. These then are the enigmas of Rousseau, judge of Jean-Jacques. The enigma of Jean-Jacques' reputation as a monster leads to a fundamental legal principle of the need to hear an accused speak in his own defense. The enigma of Jean-Jacques' lack of either virtue or vice leads to an account of natural goodness as an alternative to both Christianity and characteristically modern anti-Christian doctrines. Finally, the enigma of conspiracy against Jean-Jacques leads to an account of the high stakes involved in the philosophic attempt to tame and control the vicissitudes of public opinion. It would be good to be able to say that the purpose of this very strange work is now clear. And I do hope that I've been able to shed some light on it. We should, however, be cautious. At the very end of the third dialogue, the character Rousseau says, if we can confer with J.J. about it all, I have no doubt that we could obtain from him much enlightenment that will remain forever extinct, and that we would be surprised ourselves by the ease with which a few words from him would explain enigmas which will otherwise perhaps remain impenetrable through the skillfulness of his enemies. All we have to do is go talk to him. Similarly, in the history of the preceding writing with which the work closes, Jean-Jacques Rousseau himself refers to many enigmas that remain unsolved. The investigation started by this enigmatic work is in no danger of closing. I'll be happy to take any questions, or you can all start reading.
Can I just ask you, this is maybe a two-part question, but this goes back to the second dialogue and discussion of happiness. The first one is, I mean, doesn't this discussion of happiness seem to contrast, especially with the reverie, where he talks about happiness as the center of existence, it's sort of total absorption in the present moment, whereas here, Jean-Jacques, I mean, as you said, he seems to be more preoccupied with the present and pursuing good, but there still is the hope of divine rewards in another way. That still exists there. And therefore, it seems to be an almost incomplete conception of happiness. That's maybe the first part. And then the second part is simply, if that's a fair reading of it, why does Rousseau do that? Because it isn't as if the center of existence is only in the reveries. It seems to come from the Emile, too, which was published before this.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'll take from the reveries. One can certainly find passages in the reveries in which he says that he hopes for a reward afterwards. So, in that respect, on the surface level, there's absolutely no difference between the two works. And in fact, I think the dialogues is more consistent. I mean, what I would say is that in the Reveries, there seems to be, to me, to be a sort of alternation between Rousseau presenting himself as someone who is guided essentially by a concern for justice and as someone who's concerned essentially with happiness. And then the question for the reader is what's the relation to those? What I have tried to suggest with respect to the dialogues is that the character Jean-Jacques is presented as someone who is essentially concerned with the goodness of his life here and now, but that since there is, even for someone of his capacities, there is no guarantee of happiness here and now, he can't help but occasionally, sometimes, wish that there would be something in the future that would be a compensation. So in other words, in principle, the life of Jean-Jacques is one devoted to his heart here and now. But in practice, that turns out to be very hard to stick to at every moment, right? You know, we could say that Rousseau is someone who is extremely sensitive to the problem that we can perfectly understand something to be the most important thing that we need to do to be happy, but then actually doing it is hard, right? So it's a sort of reaction against the idea that virtue is knowledge, and that knowledge is not sufficient for virtue or for anything else. So I think, I mean, in a way, my response is to say that this distinction between sometimes and almost always rescues the dialogues from the suggestion, the implicit criticism that you made, that the teaching is that natural goodness is self-sufficient, but what happens when, he's not a Stoic. He doesn't think, what does it matter if you break my leg? If you break Rousseau's leg, he screams. Right?
This question follows up in a way on your answer. I wonder if you might compare Rousseau to Emile with respect to this question. To what extent they experience this hope for compensation. Emile is educated to be naturally good, but that ultimately is succeeded by a certain education in virtue. So this has on this question is ambiguous, and at various points in Emile, the importance of finding one's happiness within oneself is emphasized, and that's stuck to a considerable degree. But then there are these religious teachings that seem to be in some tension with that, and to put on the table something we were discussing recently. I have in mind the end of the tutor's speech to Emile on virtue in Book 5, which says the beginning of the life of the life of the just man begins after death. I mean, that's an extreme statement that the tutor makes to Emile. To what extent does that? Will that be true to the experience Emile will have, and then does that set him at odds with Rousseau and the way that you're characterizing him based on the dialogues?
Yeah, I mean, in a certain sense, no. I mean, I think the dialogues does make the case that virtue and concern for divine providence that will reward you later go together. That without the compensation, and you know, the compensation is partially just that there's someone who knows. That, you know, if you think about the Love on Speech and Book to the Republic, in which the perfectly just person is treated as if he's unjust, Rousseau, I think, thinks that part of the suffering that that person would undergo is that everybody thinks he's unjust. Presumably even the gods, because he can't make sacrifices to drive them. And so the mere fact that there is a being who's aware that you don't deserve what's happening to you is a compensation. But then an even better compensation is afterward. So I think the connection in Emile between virtue and the religious teaching is very consistent with what presented in the dialogues. But Jean-Jacques in the dialogues is presented as only sometimes having the concern with the religious question and never being concerned with virtue. I mean, he's not presented as having the slightest concern with virtue, unlike Rousseau, the character of Rousseau. It does occur to me, though, in thinking about it, you talk about the religious teaching given to Emile, but of course, you know, just as Rousseau doesn't tell us what Jean-Jacques told him about God, Rousseau in Emile doesn't tell us what the tutor tells Emile about God. Right? We get the profession of faith of the Savary vicar, but that isn't what's told to Emile. What is? We don't know. The other thing I would say, there certainly is something there, but I would say, we were also talking last night about the sequel to Emile, and one of the features of the sequel to Emile is when he goes through all of these terrible experiences he goes through, not once does he ever express a concern for what's going to happen to him after he dies, or a hope. There seems, the religious teaching doesn't seem to be at all necessary for his variance. So that makes me wonder about how much the religious teaching is connected with his marriage. Particularly since he and Sophie sort of bond over the catechism.
Could you just maybe spell that thought out?
I can't, because I just thought of it.
Okay, maybe I'll press you to a little bit. The thought being that once he's apart from Sophie, his concern with religion, his faith may diminish. That is to say, his concern with it is bound up with his association with her. Is that what you're suggesting?
Well, in a sense, yes. I mean, what I'm saying is that once his heart has been broken already, then he doesn't seem to, you know, the fear that his heart might be broken seems to be connected with the religious teaching in that speech, right? Once his heart actually is broken, then that seems to drop out of the picture. I mean, I don't know how much more I can say than that. I'm just describing what happens, not really offering an explanation of it, but it's striking.
Yeah, and surprising. You would think maybe in that moment,
you would think, yeah,
especially be that.
and you would think that when he's, you know, held as a slave in Algeria in the stone quarry, that he might think, but no spirituals coming from Emile.
I'm quite sure I put this, but starting from the enigmatic ending of the talk, it's not clear to me whether you understand this very peculiar work to be an essential part of Rousseau's so-called system or not. And it's also not clear to me, given your interpretation of the work, whether you understand the work to be something that Rousseau had to write or something that he didn't have to write.
I'm glad you went on because you started saying from your enigmatic conclusion, I'm not sure you understood this work. Then you went on. Well, let me put it this way. Yeah, this is the work in which it is most emphatically claimed that there is a system.
Right.
And
It's not the only work.
it's not the only one, but this one not only claims that there is a system, but also tells you what the basis of the system is. Now, it's the Frenchman who does this. But I've been making a case for the intelligence of the Frenchman, but we can't take him as simply a spokesperson for Jean-Jacques Rousseau. I would say this, that you could figure out the system without this work, right? I mean, that I think is true. On the other hand, it does seem to me that from the first discourse on, Rousseau is very much concerned with the fact that his own analysis leads to the conclusion that people will react to his teaching with utter incomprehension and disdain. That if it's true that the arts and the sciences are connected with corruption, and you announce that, what can you expect? Well, all the people whose careers depend upon learning and the arts and so on will attack this as being wrong. So, in other words, the more Rousseau is attacked, the more proof it is that he's right. On the other hand, what good is that? I mean, if people are doomed to misunderstand, in fact, what he's arguing. So I think that he's, from the beginning, and consistently, he is faced with the issue that two connected issues. One, that people will necessarily see some sort of relationship between his claims and him, and that people will misunderstand his arguments. And this is the work that is devoted to those issues. So I think those issues necessarily emerge from thinking about his other works. And this is the place where he addresses it squarely. And this work is in a way about nothing but that question. So I'm inclined to say that I would never say to anyone, you should begin reading Rousseau by reading this work. You never would read, first of all, you wouldn't have the slightest idea what he's talking about.
Which is very different than Plato's Apology, where
Yeah.
you often would say.
Yes, that's right. But I would say that if, having read Rousseau's works, you then want to address the question of what to make of these, this is a good beginning point for the claim that they're systematic, but don't appear to be systematic, and why that's true. So I think, I don't want to go so far as to say he had to write it in the sense that without this, we wouldn't be able to understand Rousseau, because I think that while it's true that most people who have studied Rousseau don't understand him, which has to be true because they all disagree with each other about what his position is on everything. So some of them have to be wrong, most of them have to be wrong. There are so many different positions. So it's an empirical fact that readers of Rousseau on the whole don't understand him. On the other hand, there are ones who have devoted no attention to the dialogues who have understood him well. And the Frenchman says, what you need to understand him is the two discourses, and you have to read them in the opposite order in which they were written. You read Emile first, then the second discourse. So that's what he says, but of course he doesn't have this book in front of him.
Well, let me follow up if I can. Why does Rousseau care whether he's understood? What I mean by that is Rousseau, from the beginning, makes a distinction between the few and the many. And you would think that he is primarily concerned, perhaps even exclusively concerned, to be understood rightly by the few who, given their capacities, could understand him rightly, given the way the works are written. So what is it that, now I guess you could say, well, the potential, his potential readers among the few could be, say, when young, misled in the way, but is that enough to justify writing this, a work like this? To turn it around, what is it that Rousseau is concerned to want the many to learn from this book? No, none of the many are going to read this book, very few of the few.
Yeah.
So I mean, I guess there is a rhetorical question of what is he trying to do with respect to his reputation that needs to be done from his own point, from the point of view of his own high standing.
No, I think it's an excellent question, and I think one could even go farther on it. One could say that from Rousseau's own understanding, wasn't it a big mistake to write anything?
Yeah.
I mean, in that it caused him a lot of trouble. I mean, not the writing, he sort of liked doing that, but the publishing. Why publish anything?
Same question you could ask of Plato.
Yeah, although you could say that in Plato, one could possibly construct an answer about the nature of philosophers and philosophic friendship, that you want to educate potential philosophers to be philosophers. Now, I could still raise the same question. If you say that the pursuit of wisdom is the highest good, isn't educating other people who you never meet to do that by writing books for them, taking time to do something that distracts from what's most important here? I mean,
And doesn't add in any way to your own happiness.
doesn't add in any way, that's right. So, but one can at least imagine some sort of in Rousseau it's much more problematic, I think, than Plato, but it's the same problem. I mean, Rousseau is concerned with the few, but why? Why would you even be concerned with the few? In the case of Rousseau, however, we do have a recourse to a sort of understanding of a certain sort of generosity and compassion for human beings. And so I think that from that perspective, in every one of Rousseau's major writings, there is a very clearly expressed extreme sense of a massive crisis that the world is in that is about to break forth. So in Emile, there's a famous prediction, right? The monarchies of Europe don't have long to last. A revolution's coming. Who knows what's going to happen after that? You have to teach your children to survive that. Become carpenters. Right? Similar prediction in the government of Poland. But even in the first discourse, the issue on this question of the sciences and the arts is whether it's to be brilliant and not last for very long, or whether it's better to have a stable place where people can live happily. That's the question. So, and we went for brilliance, which means we're not going to last very long, right? So in every one of Rousseau's works, there is this sense of an impending massive crisis for European civilization, and he wants to give some advice to people about how to cope with it. It's not to bring it about faster. I mean, he predicts the revolution. You could say Lenin predicts the Russian Revolution, but he also predicts it because he wants to bring it about. So he doesn't want to bring about the French Revolution. He just says everyone can see the French Revolution is coming, and it's going to go beyond the borders of France. This is the world we live in, and therefore to want to give advice to people about that is worth some effort. But it is true that in terms of the question of simply his own happiness, you know, he always says that it's not the discovery of the system that is the thing that led to all of the persecution and so on. It's the publication. And so for him, that's always a great problem. Why should he do that? And you know, sometimes will talk, he's a little bit like Gulliver in the preface to Gulliver's Travels, in which Gulliver says, you know, come on, you told me if I published this book, this would have transformed the world because people would realize the truth. It's now been out for 6 months and I don't see that any people are any better. And Rousseau says, you know, I wasted my time in the moral letters. I wasted my time telling people the truth, and now I realize that I should turn to one person and try to help that one person out. So we're back to the few. But I do think that this question, you know, I do think that the fact that both in general and especially for Rousseau, the reputation of an author takes on a life of its own that then necessarily leads the majority of people, even very intelligent ones, to misinterpret the author because they think they know what it's all about before they open the books. And that's, you know, you can see that. You know, I stopped teaching the Republic because students will start saying the most outlandish things because they've got this vague idea about Plato and you have to fight with them and so on. So teach the Gorgies, they don't think they know anything about that. So this is a great problem, and particularly with Rousseau, because Rousseau's great talent as a writer, in which he's unexcelled, is to show that in his person these general issues are revealed and to personalize the general issues for all of his readers. That's his peculiar gift, which does mean that this problem of his reputation and the content of the understanding of his books, even for people who, you know, I'll give an example of this. In one of his replies to critics of the first discourse, the King of Poland, former King of Poland, father-in-law of the King of France, wrote an attack. And Rousseau begins by saying, you know, when you're engaged in a dispute of this sort, we return to natural equality.
Thank you.
It doesn't matter who you are, right? And he says, so what's important is the argument. And then he says, but you know, I can never forget who I'm writing against. And since this is concerned with political questions, we would have to both go to Geneva for us to have an equal discussion about what are the political causes of the corruption in the world. It can't take place here. So Rousseau is acutely, concerned with this question that you can never escape addressing who the author is, who the audience is. There's no such thing as an anonymous, you know, you could say that in the early days of the internet, people thought, oh, anonymity of the internet means that the rational argument will win out. Well, what we see is that the internet means that slander and calumny is what wins out, right? And Rousseau saw that a long time ago. That's why he rejected writing anonymously, because he thought people think anonymity protects the rational discussion, but it doesn't. But that means you're stuck with him.
We have time, so.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask you if you could elaborate a little bit on this difference between goodness and the paradox, and it's neither vice or virtue. Now I can understand natural goodness because it's natural man, or the natural goodness of the first man is like an animal, so you can't really do virtue or vice. But then you seem to suggest that Rousseau, or what he's describing, is a sort of another natural goodness that he's arrived at towards the end, if that makes sense. Now, I just want to compare that with Aristotle or Plato, whereas for them, that they can see this tension between the common good and the individual good, or what we would normally describe as virtue sacrificing the greatest good for the community. That's sort of virtue, but they want to say, well, it's not necessarily moral virtue, but that's real sacrifice. But individual, intellectual virtue. If you can do intellectual virtue, then you can pursue your own good without sacrificing what's most important. So you can pursue your own good and be virtuous at the same time. But it seems like Rousseau, even though you're telling, rejects it, and I'm thinking a little bit of the moral letters, where it's sort of following your heart, wherever it leads you. It's not necessarily intellectual virtue. That is the. I don't know if that question makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. It makes a lot of sense. I would put it this way. You know, what goodness means, whether it's primitive natural goodness or Jean-Jacques' goodness, is concern for one's own preservation and well-being. So, in other words, happiness. What you want is happiness. And, you know, as you developed your question, you sort of slipped into Rousseauian language in a way when you said that for Plato and Aristotle, it's virtue. But of course, it's primarily justice. What is the relationship between justice and happiness? The Republic question, right? And you can say then, in Plato, you could put the question in terms of certain virtues which clearly are good for the person who possesses them, right? So wisdom. You don't need a dialogue saying that it's better to be wise than to be an idiot, right? Rousseau might write such a piece. But in Plato, that doesn't seem to be, it's justice, essentially. But, so therefore, there seems to be a distinction between virtues which are clearly good for the person who possesses them, and virtues whose goodness for the person who possesses them are a problem that then has to be justified. And this can then be a question of, in Aristotle, well, is it the intellectual virtues or is it the moral virtues? Which is the one that leads to happiness, or which leads to the greatest happiness? Since they're clearly not the same thing. They don't go together seamlessly. So in both Plato and Aristotle, as it seems to me, there is a distinction between philosophic virtue and vulgar virtue, or these virtues that are clearly good for the person who possesses them, and the others that are clearly good for other people, but maybe not for the person. In the case of Rousseau, Rousseau presents this same problem in a somewhat more radical way, because he presents virtue as, in a way, simply being justice. Right? That's what virtue is. Or virtue is simply moral virtue, to put it another way, with qualifications that have to be made. Are there natural virtues that are just good for you? That's a different issue. So goodness is, he radicalizes the separation between them. I mean, in Plato and Aristotle, you can say, well, they're talking about virtue. Is virtue teachable? They're all virtues, even if, is the virtue really one or is it many? And so on, but they're all virtue. And Rousseau says, no, there's virtue and there's goodness. There's goodness which is concern for your well-being. And there is virtue which is a strength that allows you to do what is right. Now, you can say then, there remains the question, what is the goodness of virtue? Is virtue, you know, and Rousseau can say that in the normal course of things, we can say that a virtuous person is more likely to be happy than a weak, vicious person who is dependent upon other people, who's manipulative, and so on, is constantly plagued by his desires, and so on. But what about those cases in which virtue breaks your heart? Right? What about those? And then there's goodness, then is the standard, I think. So while Rousseau has a case to say that the just man is happier than the unjust man in the ordinary course of things, in the dialogues, it's clear this issue of doing the right thing even if it breaks your heart is not goodness. Goodness would not allow for that. Now you could say that, you know, Plato, you could say, well, the philosophic life is, you know, philosophers are just in the sense that they don't rob temples and don't pick people's pockets. You know, that's said in the Republic. Well, that's justice as not doing certain things. Well, that's just like Jean-Jacques. He doesn't rob temples or pick people's pockets either. So you could say that goodness in Rousseau is analogous to philosophy in the Republic as a source of happiness, but it's clearly not identical. They're not identical, but they perform the analogous role. So then we'd have to address the question, well, okay, so we've got justice versus philosophy, justice versus goodness. What about goodness in philosophy? Is philosophy good for the philosopher, or does philosophy just corrupt your goodness, make you miserable, and make you into a rotten human being? Like there's another, you have to invite me back for but I mean, you know, it's an excellent question because you can see that the same fundamental issue that we find in Aristotle and Plato is in Rousseau, but the apparently simple shift of the term from virtue to good, you know, that something which is a particular sort of virtue in Aristotle and Plato is no longer a virtue in Rousseau, it's goodness. And also virtue changes its meaning. Virtue is strength to do what's not good for you because it's the right thing to do. And that's a change from, you know, certainly Aristotle would say that, you know, liberality isn't something that's unpleasant for the liberal person. It's not overcoming how pleasant it would be to hold on to all this money for yourself. That's not the issue. So everything's transformed by that change. But it's still exactly the same issue.
I'm wondering if you think at the end that Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the person, thinks that in doing this, he got his fair day in trial. Like, the defense of the accused was heard. And I wonder that because you mentioned that the Frenchman talks about the other works and the order in which you should read them. I'm also thinking about, he refers to specific parts of the works and the dialogues. And I'm not thinking of which character it is, but he talks about the part on taste in the Emile, and he references, there's a whole list of specific things that the reader should look at, and you couldn't think that his soul was corrupted if you had read these specific things. So I'm wondering, sort of, are we meant to think that the evidence has been presented, he has acted as judge, and now we are done? Or are we meant to go revisit the entirety of the, in a way I think it's related to Dick's question, like, are we meant to go revisit the entirety of the project with the things that he's directed us to in the order that he's directed us to reinterpret and rehab it out because public opinion all along has not accurately assessed?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, you know, if you take the argument for the necessity of hearing the accused, that isn't the guarantee that the accused will be let off when he's innocent, right? I mean, both both Rousseau and Jean-Jacques in the dialogues refer to the possibility that trials can be rigged even when the accused is heard, right? So it's a sort of elevation of a legal standard, which we understand perfectly well is not infallible. And so Jean-Jacques Rousseau is very well aware of that. And given, you know, the insistence that Rousseau, the character, feels about this personal connection and go visit him and let's go visit him and we'll consult about what to do and so on. You know, Rousseau knows no one who reads this, other than the couple of people he gave the manuscript to, whose reactions were very disappointing to him, is going to have the opportunity to do that, right? So we're all in the position of the Frenchman, and the Frenchman says, read the books. You have to read them more than once, and you have to read them in the right order, and so on. So yeah, I mean, he doesn't think this is anything more than a beginning. That's why I said after you read all of Rousseau, then when you still want to start making sense of it, then you start with the dialogues and then go to the other things. But no, I think you're right. I mean, we are stuck. You know, and the title is, you know, it's untranslatable because we don't know whether it's a noun or a verb, right? There's Rousseau, and there's no colon there. It's just Rousseau, and then juge de Jean-Jacques, which can be judge of Jean-Jacques, which means he's the judge. Or it could be Rousseau judges about Jean-Jacques, which is a less emphatic account of his role. Rousseau judges about, because it's not judges Jean-Jacques, not pass judgment on it, makes judgments about Jean-Jacques. When I was working on the translation of this, I was at a Rousseau conference and asked a bunch of very prestigious Rousseau scholars how they would translate the title, and someone suggested Rousseau on trial, the right way to translate it. And that's sort of right, but then that, of course, leaves it open-ended, as you suggest, for what the reader would make of it.
Are we about to end?
Yeah, we have time for one more.
Then I'll ask. As you pointed out, nowhere in Rousseau, and in at least two places, Rousseau, nowhere does he sort of try to settle the God question. Let's just say the existence of God. And in two instances, you might say, we sort of expect that he will, and he doesn't. Is it possible, in your view, on the basis of what he did write, when properly read, to know whether Rousseau thought he could give an adequate answer to the question?
Okay, so you're not asking, is it possible to figure out what his opinion might be about this, but whether he thought he had a conclusive judgment?
Well, I guess I'm asking both. I'm not sure how you could separate the two, but you can respond to me either way, or. In other words, I guess I'm getting to the question of whether Rousseau thought that, let's say, his own happiness somehow depended on being able to provide an adequate answer to that question. And if he did, what was his answer and what was the argument? And if he didn't, why didn't he? I mean, that's a very big question.
Just a small question.
Yeah, it's a very big question, but you're one of the few people I would trust to give a good answer.
Oh, come on, you could ask Arthur Meltzer about this, and he would give a perfectly fine
I
answer.
don't think so. Arthur was never very that much interested in that question.
Okay.
Take note, everyone. If you leave MSU, send it all.
Okay. why Rousseau doesn't deal with this directly and openly, he explains in the letter to Voltaire, in which he blames Voltaire for writing, his account of the Lisbon earthquake to say this proves there's no divine providence because of all these innocent people who died in Turkey today. Rousseau says that you have taken away from people who may be suffering the one consolation that they have in their life, and that you shouldn't do that. And so he presents arguments against Voltaire's arguments, and he says, well, you and I both believe in God, so we don't worry about this. So, you and I have exactly the same opinion about God, therefore we don't need to argue about this. Just as he does with the Archbishop Beaumont. He says, well, you and I both believe in God, so we don't have to argue this with you. So he makes it impossible for the opponent to argue against him. So he has reasons for not wanting to go public with his opinions to the extent that they're unorthodox in a particular way. Now, he's certainly willing to be unorthodox and insist that he's right. So let's say, for example, the issue is not just belief in God, but belief in particular theological positions. And so Rousseau clearly says that he not only does not believe in original sin, but that he can give a conclusive argument against it. That original sin is incapable of giving an account of its own principle. And I think he believed that. He also insists that, well, he does not believe in miracles, he does not believe that it's possible to give an argument to prove the impossibility of miracles. So, otherwise, I think you can find plenty of discussions in Rousseau about the limitations of what it is possible for human beings to know with certainty that bear on a theological question. And he's very much concerned with limitations. On the other hand, there are also some things about themselves that he thinks that human beings can know with certainty. It's not easy to know those things. Therefore, I think that he believes, is convinced, not just persuaded, but is convinced that he has sufficient arguments to know that he cannot be justly punished by God for not believing him. But I think, it's a very difficult question. So if you're...
We don't the question whether we can be unjustly punished.
Yeah, well,
It doesn't matter whether you're justly or unjustly.
Well, is an omnipotent, malevolent being who's unconcerned with justice worthy of being called God?
Yeah, again, he might not be worthy of it, but he might exist. I mean, what does worthiness mean here?
Yeah. Well, what is a God?
I guess that would be something like complete reliance on rational theology. God can't be this, and can't be this, and he can't be.
Yeah, I don't think that's what he.
No, I know. I think that's really clear.
Yeah. No, it's a difficult question.
And also the stakes are very high for Rousseau because he, insofar as he is concerned about others, as he is, seems to be in the answer to all, it's not just that denying the existence of God, or at least a God of a certain kind, removes what may be the only consolation for a certain kind of person. It also fundamentally undermines virtue, as Rousseau understands virtue, which is dependent on certain theological arguments.
Yeah. No, well, that I would say is not true. I mean, ultimately, the ultimate goodness of virtue does depend upon those theological arguments. But the goodness of virtue in the ordinary course of things for most people does not depend on those arguments. It is possible that it is, I think Rousseau thinks it is possible to demonstrate that unjust people are miserable. And, you know, simply unjust.
But can you demonstrate that it is good for the virtuous person to die in battle?
But that I think he could even say that it would be good for a virtuous person to sacrifice those dearest to them is another question, right? So, yeah, I mean that's the importance of goodness, right, in the argument. I mean, I think, unlike many intelligent people say, well, Rousseau just presents these different alternatives without making a final judgment between citizenship, Walker, so on. He makes the case for each of them and so on. I think that there's a clear hierarchy, and the hierarchy is goodness, virtue. With the provision that goodness has certain vulnerabilities to it, that virtue doesn't. You can be good and weak, and then you're very susceptible to not getting what's good for you, and also very susceptible to being corrupted and making yourself miserable. So goodness without strength is problematic, but goodness accompanied with strength, and that's the way in which Jean-Jacques is portrayed as strong. He never is interested in anything except pursuing his own good. That's the only thing that interests him. And that sounds, put in a certain way, that sounds terrible, right? But put in another way, somebody just can't be distracted from the good. Is not so terrible. But virtue, as he presents it, it's impossible not to admire the strength and see the advantages for the person who possesses it of the strength that allows you to do unpleasant things out of an understanding of your own freedom and independence. So in other words, in terms of something that's good for you. However, he does insist that there are occasions, there's wonderful, the letter to Franquier is wonderful in this. This young man writes to him asking for advice, saying, I admire your writing so much, but on the other hand, you seem to admire Jesus, and Socrates is just so much better than Jesus, and I admire Socrates, and furthermore, I'm a materialist, but I don't think you need God for virtue, and you seem to think that, and for me, virtue is such a beautiful thing that I'm just that makes me virtuous. And Rousseau says, well, of course, virtue is a beautiful thing, but on the other hand, if your best friend is out of town and you're spending time with his wife, she comes on to you, and no one's going to tell, and no one's ever going to know. There's the beauty of virtue, and there's her. And furthermore, if you're a materialist, what does it mean to talk about the beauty of virtue? Whereas to talk about her beauty and attraction, that we can understand. So he says, I know what I would do in this case. But without religion, wouldn't anybody do that? Right? So Virtue in certain sorts of situations needs religion. If only to, whether it needs immortality is another question, because the mere fact that there is a witness who will appreciate what you are doing in sacrificing something prevents, the great problem with virtue is that one gets demoralized. That you see the virtuous people lose it. And that's demoralizing. You want them to be happy. And so even a witness to it, a reliable witness, is helpful. Salvation's even better. So I think but still Rousseau is able to present a defense of virtue in terms of it being good for the person who's virtuous, but without insisting that this applies in the extreme instance. So if it's the case of the Glaucon poses, his eyes burned out, and everybody believes he's unjust. Right? Rousseau would place a great deal more emphasis on that. But Glaucon, it's there in Glaucon's speech. Everyone, even your family, thinks you're unjust. And Socrates doesn't present a case for the just man in those circumstances. It seems to me there's nothing at the end about, when it's proven that the just man is 729 times as happy as the tyrant, it's not the just man whose eyes are being burned out and everybody believes it's unjust who's 729 times as happy. That's sort of left in the air. So there is a sort of stoicism invited by Plato that none of this matters as long as you're just going to be happy. But neither Plato nor Rousseau, it seems to me, believes that.
Well, on that very important, life-changing point, let's, or maybe life-confirming, let's thank Professor Keller.